Indian removal was a policy of the United States government in the 19th century whereby Native Americans were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands in the eastern United States to lands west of the Mississippi River, thereafter known as Indian Territory. That policy has been characterized by some scholars as part of a long-term genocide of Native Americans by European settlers to North America in the colonial period and citizens of the United States until the mid-20th century. The policy traced its direct origins to the administration of James Monroe, though it addressed conflicts between whites and Native Americans that had been occurring since the 17th century, and were getting worse by the early 19th century as white settlers were increasingly pushing west. The Indian Removal Act was the key act that enforced Indian removal and was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. The revolutionary background. Some of the American revolutionary thinkers and leaders viewed the American Indians not as a single people, but as nations in their own right, and developed early policies for the new United States to interact with the Indian nations. Benjamin Franklin, in his proposed Articles of Confederation for the nation about to take birth, called for a perpetual alliance with the Indians, especially with the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. Article 11. A perpetual alliance, offensive and defensive, is to be entered into as soon as may be with the Six Nations, the limits to be ascertained and secured to them, the land not to be encroached on, nor any private colony purchases made of them hereafter to be held good, nor any contract for lands to be made but between the Great Council of the Indians at Onondaga and the General Congress. The boundaries and lands of all the other Indians shall also be ascertained and secured to them in the same manner, and persons appointed to reside among them in proper districts, who shall take care to prevent injustice in the trade with them, and be enabled at our general expense by occasional small supplies, to relieve the personal wants and distresses, and all purchases from them shall be by the Congress for the general advantage and benefit of the United Colonies. Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, defended American Indian culture and marveled at how the tribes of Virginia never submitted themselves to any laws, any coercive power, any shadow of government, due to their moral sense of right and wrong. He would later write, "I believe the Indian then to be in body and mind equal to the white men." His desire was for the Native Americans to intermix with European Americans and to become one people. To achieve that end, President Jefferson would, in addition to offering U.S. citizenship to some of the Indian nations, propose lending credit to them for trade with the expectation they would be unable to honor their debts and thereby the United States would acquire the land. President George Washington, while addressing the Seneca Nation in 1790, publicly pledged to uphold their just rights, and described the pre-constitutional defrauding of the Indians out of the land as evil. In March and April of 1792, Washington met with 50 tribal chiefs in Philadelphia, including the Iroquois, to discuss closer friendship between them and the United States. Later that same year, Washington stressed the need for building peace, trust, and commerce with America's Indian neighbors. I cannot dismiss the subject of Indian affairs without again recommending to your consideration the expediency of more adequate provision for giving energy to the laws throughout our interior frontier, and for restraining the commission of outrages upon the Indians, without which all Pacific plans must prove nugatory. To to enable, by competent rewards, the employment of qualified and trusty persons to reside among them as agents, would also contribute to the preservation of peace and good neighborhood. If, in addition to these expedients, an eligible plan could be devised for promoting civilization among the friendly tribes, and for carrying on trade with them upon a scale equal to the wants, and under regulations calculated to protect them from imposition and extortion, its influence in cementing their interests with ours could not but be considerable. In 1795, in his seventh message to Congress, Washington expressed that if the U.S. government wanted peace with the Indians, then it must give peace to them, and that if the U.S. wanted raids by Indians to stop, then raids by American frontier inhabitants must also stop. Early congressional acts. The new Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which would, for years to come, serve broadly as a precedent for the manner in which the United States' territorial expansion would occur. Called for the protection of Indians' property, rights, and liberty. Article 3. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent, and, in the property, rights, and liberty, they shall never be invaded or disturbed, unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress, but laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them, and for preserving peace and friendship with them. The U.S. Constitution of 1787 calls for regulating commerce with the Indian tribes, and makes their importance to Congress equal to that of the states and foreign governments. In 1790, Congress passed the Indian Non-Intercourse Act to protect and codify the Indians' land rights. The above acts and sentiments stood in contrast with those of President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s Jeffersonian Policy. As President, Thomas Jefferson developed far-reaching Indian policy that had two primary goals. The security of the fledgling United States was paramount, so Jefferson wanted to assure the native nations were tightly bound to the United States, and not other foreign nations. Secondly, he wanted to civilize them into agricultural or more urbanized lifestyles. These goals would be achieved through trade and treaties. He encouraged American policy to allow Native Americans to remain east of the Mississippi as long as they became assimilated or civilized. As president, Jefferson made sustained efforts to win the friendship and cooperation of many Native American nations. He repeatedly articulated his aspirations for a united nation of both whites and Indians, such as the following from a letter to the Seneca spiritual leader Handsome Lake, dated November 3, 1802. Go on then, brother, in the great reformation you have undertaken. In all your enterprises for the good of your people, you may count with confidence on the aid and protection of the United States, and on the sincerity and zeal with which I am myself animated in the furthering of this humane work. You are our brethren of the same land. We wish your prosperity as brethren should do. Farewell. Jefferson's personal non-sectarian religiosity appears to show in his references to the Great Spirit, as in the following letter to the Choctaw Nation dated December 17, 1803. I am glad, brothers, you are willing to go and visit some other parts of our country. We thank the Great Spirit who took care of you on the ocean, and brought you safe and in good health to the seat of our great council, and we hope his care will accompany and protect you on your journey and return home, and that he will preserve and prosper your nation in all its just pursuits. President Jefferson also sought full U.S. citizenship for those Indian nations which desired it, including the Cherokee. In his 8th annual message to Congress on November 8, 1808, he presented to the nation a vision of white and Indian unity. With our Indian neighbors the public peace has been steadily maintained. And, generally, from a conviction that we consider them as part of ourselves, and cherish with sincerity the rights and interests. The attachment of the Indian tribes is gaining strength daily, and will amply requite us for the justice and friendship practiced towards them. Near the two great divisions of the Cherokee nation have now under consideration to solicit the citizenship of the United States, and to be identified with us in laws and government, in such progressive manner as we shall think best. Years after the Jefferson presidency, in 1817, the U.S. government would again offer citizenship to the Cherokee who lived east of the Mississippi River, along with 640 acres per family. As other writings illustrate, his general compassion for the Indians at times gave way to impatience with nations which responded unfavorably to his communications with them, and to his frustration with the limited success of his efforts. His intention was to change the lifestyle from hunter-gatherer to farming, largely through the decrease of game rendering the subsistence by hunting insufficient. Jefferson expected that the switch to agriculture would make them dependent on white Americans for trade goods and therefore more likely to give up their land in exchange. In an 1803 letter to William Henry Harrison, Jefferson wrote, "When they withdraw themselves to the culture of a small piece of land, they will perceive how useless to them are their extensive forests, and will be willing to pare them off from time to time in exchange for necessaries for the farms and families. To promote this disposition to exchange lands which they have to spare and we want, for necessaries which we have to spare and they want, we shall push our trading uses, and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cession of lands. At our trading houses, too, we mean to sell so low as merely to repay cost and charges, so as neither to lessen or enlarge our capital. This is what private traders cannot do, for they must gain. They will consequently retire from the competition, and we shall thus get clear of this pest without giving offense or umbrage to the Indians. In this way our settlements will gradually circumscribe and approach the Indians, and they will in time either incorporate with us as citizens of the United States, or remove beyond the Mississippi. The former is certainly the termination of the history most happy for themselves, but, in the whole course of this, it is essential to cultivate the love. As to the fear, we presume that our strength and the weakness is now so visible that they must see we have only to shut our hand to crush them, and that all our liberalities to them proceed from motives of pure humanity only. Should any tribe be foolhardy enough to take up the hatchet at any time, the seizing the whole country of that tribe, and driving them across the Mississippi, as the only condition of peace, would be an example to others, and a furtherance of our final consolidation. However, elsewhere in the same letter, Jefferson spoke of protecting the Indians from injustices perpetrated by whites. Our system is to live in perpetual peace with the Indians, to cultivate an affectionate attachment from them, by everything just and liberal which we can do for them within reason, and by giving them effectual protection against wrongs from our own people. Native American land was sometimes purchased, either via treaty or under duress. The idea of land exchange, that is, Native Americans would give up the land east of the Mississippi in exchange for a similar amount of territory west of the river, was first proposed by Jefferson in 1803 and was first incorporated into treaties in 1817. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 incorporated this concept. Calhoun's plan. Under President James Monroe, Secretary of War John C. Calhoun devised the first plans for Indian removal. By late 1824, Monroe approved Calhoun's plans and in a special message to the Senate on January 27, 1825, requested the creation of the Arkansas Territory and Indian Territory. The Indians east of the Mississippi were to voluntarily exchange the lands for lands west of the river. The Senate accepted Monroe's request and asked Calhoun to draft a bill, which was killed in the House of Representatives by the Georgia delegation. President John Quincy Adams assumed the Calhoun-Monroe policy and was determined to remove the Indians by non-forceful means. But Georgia refused to submit to Adams' request and forced Adams to make a treaty with Creeks and Cherokees granting Georgia what it wanted. When Andrew Jackson became the president from the newly organized Democratic Party, he agreed that the Indians should be forced to exchange eastern lands for western lands. Indian Removal Act. When Andrew Jackson became President of the United States in 1829, his government took a hard line. Jackson abandoned the policy of his predecessors of treating different Indian groups as separate nations. Instead, he aggressively pursued plans against all Indian tribes which claimed constitutional sovereignty and independence from state laws, and which were based east of the Mississippi River. They were to be removed to reservations in Indian Territory west of the Mississippi, where the laws could be sovereign without any state interference. At Jackson's request, the United States Congress opened a debate on an Indian removal bill. After fierce disagreements, the Senate passed the measure 28-19, the House 102-97. Jackson signed the legislation into law May 30, 1830. In 1830, the majority of the 5 civilized tribes, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee, were living east of the Mississippi as they had for thousands of years. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 implemented the U.S. government policy towards the Indian populations, which called for moving Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi River to lands west of the river. While it did not authorize the forced removal of the indigenous tribes, it authorized the president to negotiate land exchange treaties with tribes located in lands of the United States. Choctaw. On September 27, 1830, the Choctaw signed the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek and by concession, became the first Native American tribe to be removed. The agreement represented one of the largest transfers of land that was signed between the U.S. government and Native Americans without being instigated by warfare. By the treaty, the Choctaw signed away the remaining traditional homelands, opening them up for European American settlement in Mississippi Territory. When the Choctaw reached Little Rock, a Choctaw chief referred to the trek as a trail of tears and death. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French philosopher, witnessed the Choctaw removals while in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1831. In the whole scene there was an air of ruin and destruction, something which portrayed a final and irrevocable adieu. One couldn't watch without feeling one's heart wrung. The Indians were tranquil, but somber and taciturn. There was one who could speak English and of whom I asked why the Choctaws were leaving the country. To be free, he answered, could never get any other reason out of him. We'd watch the expulsion of one of the most celebrated and ancient American peoples, Cherokee. While the Indian Removal Act made the move of the tribes voluntary, it was often abused by government officials. The best-known example is the Treaty of New Echota. It was negotiated and signed by a small faction of Cherokee tribal members, not the tribal leadership, on December 29, 1835. It resulted in the forced relocation of the tribe in 1838. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee died in the march, now known as the Trail of Tears. Missionary organizer Jeremiah Evarts urged the Cherokee Nation to take the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Marshall Court ruled that while Native American tribes were sovereign nations, state laws had no force on tribal lands. In spite of this acculturation, many white settlers and land speculators simply desired the land. Some claimed the presence was a threat to peace and security. Some U.S. states, like Georgia in 1830, passed a law which prohibited whites from living on Native American territory after March 31, 1831, without a license from the state. This law was written to justify removing white missionaries who were helping the Native Americans resist removal. Seminole in 1835, the Seminole refused to leave the lands in Florida, leading to the Second Seminole War. Oski Ola led the Seminole in the fight against removal. Based in the Everglades of Florida, Oski Ola and his band used surprise attacks to defeat the U.S. Army in many battles. In 1837, Oski Ola was seized by deceit upon the orders of U.S. General Thomas Jesup when Oski Ola came under a flag of truce to negotiate peace. Oski Ola died in prison of illness. The war would end up costing the U.S. over 1,500 deaths and cost the government $20 million. Some Seminole traveled deeper into the Everglades, while others moved west. Removal continued out west and numerous wars ensued over land. Muskogee. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Fort Jackson and the Treaty of Washington, the Muskogee were confined to a small strip of land in present-day east-central Alabama. Following the Indian Removal Act, in 1832 the Creek National Council signed the Treaty of Cusseta, ceding the remaining lands east of the Mississippi to the U.S. and accepting relocation to the Indian Territory. Most Muskogee were removed to Indian Territory during the Trail of Tears in 1834, although some remained behind. Friends and brothers, by permission of the Great Spirit above, and the voice of the people, I have been made President of the United States, and now speak to you as your father and friend, and request you to listen. Your warriors have known me long. You know I love my white and red children, and always speak with a straight, and not with a forked tongue, that I have always told you the truth. Where are you now? You and my white children are too near to each other to live in harmony and peace. Your game is destroyed, and many of your people will not work until the earth, beyond the great river Mississippi, where a part of your nation has gone. Your father has provided a country large enough for all of you, and he advises you to remove to it. But your white brothers will not trouble you. They will have no claim to the land, and you can live upon it, you and all your children, as long as the grass grows and the water runs, in peace and plenty. It will be yours forever, for the improvements in the country where you now live, and for all the stock which you cannot take with you. Your father will pay you a fair price. Chickasaw. Unlike other tribes who exchanged land grants, the Chickasaw were to receive mostly financial compensation of $3 million from the United States for the lands east of the Mississippi River. In 1836, the Chickasaw had reached an agreement that purchased land from the previously removed Choctaw after a bitter 5-year debate. They paid the Choctaw $530,000 for the westernmost part of Choctaw land. The first group of Chickasaw moved in 1837. The $3 million that the U.S. owed the Chickasaw went unpaid for nearly 30 years. Aftermath. As a result, the 5 tribes were resettled in the new Indian Territory in modern-day Oklahoma and parts of Kansas. Some indigenous nations resisted forced migration more forcefully. Those few who stayed behind eventually formed tribal groups, including the Eastern Cherokee, based in North Carolina, Virginia, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and the Creeks in Atmore, Alabama. Southern removals. Many figures have been rounded. The North. Tribes in the Old Northwest were far smaller and more fragmented than the 5 civilized tribes, so the treaty and emigration process was more piecemeal. Bands of Shawnee, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Sauk, and Meskwaki signed treaties and relocated to the Indian Territory. In 1832, a Sauk leader named Black Hawk led a band of Sauk and Fox back to the lands in Illinois. In the Black Hawk War, the U.S. Army and Illinois militia defeated Black Hawk and his warriors, resulting in the Sauk and Fox being relocated into what would become modern-day Iowa. The Iroquois were also supposed to be part of Indian removal, and the Treaty of Buffalo Creek arranged for them to be removed to land in Wisconsin and Kansas. However, the land company that was to purchase the land for the territories reneged on the deal, and subsequent treaties in 1842 and 1857 gave back most of the Iroquois' reservations and touched. Only the Buffalo Creek Reservation was ever dissolved as part of the removal program. A small portion was purchased back over a century later to build a casino. Jackson's reputation. Andrew Jackson's reputation took a blow for his treatment of the Indians. Historians who admired Jackson's strong presidential leadership, such as Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., would skip over the Indian question with a footnote. In 1969, Francis Paul Prussia argued that Jackson's removal of the 5 civilized tribes from the very hostile white environment in the Old South to Oklahoma probably saved the very existence. In the 1970s, however, Jackson came under sharp attack from writers such as Michael Paul Rodgin and Howard Zinn, chiefly on this issue. In the 21st century, his reputation has improved somewhat. Paul R. Bartrop and Stephen Leonard Jacobs argue that Jackson's policies did not meet the criterion for genocide or cultural genocide. Jackson historian Steve Inskeep reports, recent Jackson biographers, such as John Meacham and H. W. Brands, candidly describe the human cost of Jackson's policy while keeping it in the perspective of his broader career. Sean Willens, in The Rise of American Democracy, observed that while Jackson was a paternalist telling Indians what was best for them, paternalism was not the same as genocide.